Welcome to my channel. Here, you will find a collection of mysterious and thrilling stories that will captivate your imagination. Put on your headphones for an immersive audio experience, as every sound and detail is designed to enhance the atmosphere. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with your friends who enjoy mysterious tales. Your support means so much and helps this channel grow. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of pine and damp earth as the group of friends trudged through the dense forest, their boots crunching over fallen leaves. The sun had begun its descent, casting long, eerie shadows between the towering trees. They had been walking for over an hour, guided only by a well-worn trail and the vague directions they had printed from the internet. "Are we even going the right way?" Lisa asked, adjusting the straps of her backpack. Her tone was light but carried a trace of concern. "Relax," Jason replied confidently. "The cabin should be just up ahead. This is exactly where the map says it should be." Jason, the self-appointed leader of their group, had organized the trip. He had always been the adventurous one, eager to push boundaries and drag his friends along for the ride. The others followed somewhat reluctantly, each with their own motivations for joining. Lisa had agreed to come, mainly because her best friend Emma wouldn't go without her. Emma, the quiet and observant one, had always been fascinated by folklore and ghost stories, making this trip the perfect blend of adventure and mystery for her. Then there was Mark, the prankster of the group, who saw the weekend as a prime opportunity to pull off some elaborate scares. His girlfriend, Rachel, was less enthusiastic, but unwilling to let him have all the fun without her. Ben and Sophie, the last of their group, were the couple who preferred solitude, but had been persuaded by Jason's insistence that they needed this real wilderness experience. The forest around them thickened, the trees standing closer together as if they were intruding on sacred ground. The further they went, the quieter the surroundings became, the usual rustling of birds and insects eerily absent. Emma noticed it first. "Do you hear that?" she asked, stopping in her tracks. "Hear what?" Mark smirked. "The sound of Jason leading us in circles?" "No," Emma said, frowning. "That's just it. There's nothing. No birds, no animals. It's weird. It's just the season," Jason dismissed, but his voice lacked conviction. A few more minutes of hiking brought them to their destination, a small abandoned cabin nestled between the trees, its wooden exterior weathered and worn. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar as if welcoming them inside. Jason grinned. "Told you we were going the right way." "Great," Rachel muttered. "This place looks like the perfect setting for a horror movie." "That's the spirit," Mark nudged her playfully. "Embrace the atmosphere." The group hesitated before stepping inside, the floorboards groaning beneath their weight. The air was thick with dust, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. A stone fireplace sat in the center of the main room, its cold hearth waiting to be filled with flames. An old wooden table stood against the far wall, and a few moth-eaten chairs were scattered around it. The place had clearly been abandoned for years. "All right, let's set up," Jason said. "Girls take the left room, guys take the right." The group divided, unpacking sleeping bags and supplies. As they settled in, Mark found an old, tattered journal buried under a pile of debris in the corner. The leather cover was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and brittle. "Look at this," he said, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was uneven, frantic. He read aloud. "They watch from the trees. They whisper at night. Do not listen. Do not follow." A chill settled over the group. Emma took the journal from Mark's hands, scanning the pages with growing unease. "Maybe we shouldn't be here," she murmured. "Come on, Em," Jason said with a forced chuckle. "It's just some old campfire story. Someone probably left it here to scare people." Then why does it feel so real? She whispered. Night fell swiftly, wrapping the forest in an impenetrable darkness. The group gathered around the fireplace, the flickering flames casting moving shadows across the walls. Mark, never one to pass up the opportunity for theatrics, started telling ghost stories. He spoke of missing campers, of creatures lurking just beyond the trees, their voices mimicking human speech to lure victims away. As he spoke, a distant rustling sound broke the silence outside. The group fell silent, eyes darting toward the cabin's only window. The darkness beyond seemed to press against the glass, suffocating in its vast emptiness. Probably just an animal, Jason said, though his voice was quieter now. Or something else, Emma whispered. The night stretched on, and one by one, they retreated to their rooms. The wind outside howled, rattling the fragile walls of the cabin. In the stillness, Lisa thought she heard something. Whispers, faint and indistinct, carried on the wind. She pressed her ear to the wall, heart pounding. The voices were too soft to understand, but they were there, and they were getting closer. The morning sun barely filtered through the thick canopy of trees, casting an eerie glow over the damp forest floor. The group awoke groggy and unsettled, the unease of the previous night still lingering in the air. Lisa had barely slept, haunted by the whispers she had heard in the wind. She hesitated to tell the others, fearing they would dismiss it as her imagination. Jason stretched and yawned. All right, today's the day we explore. We should check out the area, maybe find that lake I read about. I don't know, Emma said cautiously. I have a bad feeling about this place. Maybe we should just head back. Mark laughed. Come on, Em. Don't tell me that stupid journal actually scared you. Before she could respond, a sharp, piercing scream tore through the morning air. The group froze. Rachel was the first to move, sprinting toward the sound with Mark close behind. The others followed, their hearts pounding as they ran through the dense underbrush. As they reached a small clearing, they skidded to a stop. Sophie stood motionless, her face drained of color. Her trembling hand pointed toward the ground. Lying there, half buried in the leaves, was a single boot, and inside it was a severed foot. The group stood paralyzed, unable to process what they were seeing. Lisa clutched Emma's arm, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Jason, usually so confident, took a hesitant step forward. He reached down, his fingers trembling as he touched the boot. It was ice cold. A rustling sound came from the trees, making them all whip around in fear. The shadows between the trunks seemed to move, shifting like something, or someone, was watching them. Then just as suddenly as it had come, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before. It wasn't just quiet. It was oppressive, suffocating. The wind had ceased, the leaves no longer rustling. The group exchanged fearful glances, each of them trying to rationalize what they had just found. We need to go, Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. No arguments here, Jason said, his bravado finally cracking. Let's head back to the cabin and pack up. As they turned, a whisper floated through the trees. This time they all heard it, and it was calling their names. The group moved in a panicked silence, their footsteps crunching against the damp leaves as they made their way back to the cabin. The forest felt different now, more alive, yet at the same time, suffocatingly still. The whispers that had called their names moments before had faded, but the unease lingered in their bones. We need to get out of here. Now, Lisa whispered, clutching her arms tightly around herself. Jason nodded, but his eyes flickered with hesitation. We should at least grab our stuff first. No one argued. The thought of running blindly into the dark without their supplies was almost as terrifying as staying. They broke into a hurried jog, desperate to reach the cabin before something else happened. The moment they stepped inside, a gust of wind slammed the door shut behind them, making Rachel shriek. It's just the wind, Mark said, though his usual cocky tone was gone. The cabin no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like a trap. Ben was the first to start gathering supplies, shoving everything haphazardly into his backpack. "We should stick together. No one goes anywhere alone." The others nodded in agreement. They were shaken, but at least now they had a plan. But before they could put it into motion, a sound came from the far end of the cabin. A slow, deliberate knock against the wooden wall. They all turned, breath held, listening. Another knock, then another, each louder than the last. Mark grabbed the fire poker from the hearth and stepped forward cautiously. "If this is one of you messing around, I swear." A sudden crash echoed through the cabin as the window nearest to them shattered. Shards of glass flew across the floor, and a gust of icy wind rushed inside, bringing with it an unmistakable whisper. "Come closer." Sophie screamed, and in the blink of an eye, the lanterns flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. Chaos erupted. Someone knocked over a chair. Someone else tripped. In the confusion, Lisa grabbed for Emma's hand, but Emma wasn't there. "Emma." Lisa's voice was swallowed by the dark. Jason flicked on his flashlight, the weak beam cutting through the cabin, illuminating the terrified faces around him. But Emma was gone. The wind outside howled louder now, the whispers returning, curling around them like invisible tendrils. Something was waiting beyond the broken window, and it had taken Emma. A scream pierced the night, Emma's voice, distant, echoing through the trees. Then silence. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound in the cabin was their ragged breathing. The temperature had dropped, an unnatural chill settling in the air. "Where is she?" Lisa choked out, her hands trembling as she scanned the room. Jason pointed his flashlight toward the broken window. Beyond the shattered glass, the forest stretched out, vast and unknowable. "She must have gone outside," he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. "That doesn't make any sense," Lisa snapped. "She was right here. She wouldn't just run off." "Then someone took her," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. The group exchanged looks, each of them wrestling with the horrifying implication. "Okay," Mark said, gripping the fire poker even tighter. "We're not going to panic. We grab more flashlights, we stick together, and we find her." "You want to go out there?" Rachel asked, her voice shrill. "After everything that's been happening?" "We can't just leave her," Lisa protested. Rachel's eyes darted to the window, then back to the others. Her entire body was shaking. "What if it's not Emma out there?" she whispered. Silence. "Then we bring her back," Jason said finally, his jaws set in determination. Armed with flashlights, a hunting knife Jason had packed, and Mark's fire poker, the group cautiously stepped outside. The forest swallowed them whole, its towering trees stretching high into the night sky. "Emma," Lisa called out. Her voice sounded small, insignificant in the vast darkness. A cold wind rustled the branches, and the whispering started again. Software almost teasing. "Lisa. Lisa ... Lisa froze. "Did you hear that?" The others nodded, gripping their makeshift weapons tighter. "It said my name," she whispered. "Just keep moving," Jason muttered. Eyes forward. They followed the beam of their flashlights, scanning the ground for any sign of Emma's footprints. The further they ventured, the more the whispers surrounded them, circling, creeping closer. Then, up ahead, they saw her. Emma stood with her back to them, motionless in the middle of the trail. Her long hair cascaded down her back, her shoulders rising and falling in slow, unnatural breaths. Lisa surged forward, relief flooding her chest. "Emma!" But Jason grabbed her arm, yanking her back. "Wait," he hissed. Something was wrong. Emma didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge them. She just stood there, her body swaying slightly, as if listening to something they couldn't hear. "Emma?" Mark called hesitantly. Slowly, Emma's head tilted to the side, just a little too far, like a marionette being manipulated by unseen strings. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. "Emma, please say something." A long pause. Then, in a voice that wasn't quite Emma's, she whispered, "You shouldn't be here." A chill ran down Lisa's spine. "Emma, what's wrong?" Another pause. Then Emma took a step forward. And another. But something was off. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as if she were struggling against invisible restraints. And then they saw her eyes. Her pupils were dilated, almost black, reflecting the moonlight like an animal's. Her lips parted slightly, and the whispers in the air grew louder, as if they were coming from inside her. "That's not Emma," Rachel whimpered. "Run," Ben whispered. Emma took another step forward, then another, and then she lunged. A scream tore through the trees as the group scattered, their flashlights bouncing wildly in the dark. Lisa ran blindly, her breath coming in short gasps, heart hammering in her chest. Behind her, she could hear Jason shouting, Mark swearing, Rachel sobbing. The forest became a blur of shadows and panic. Twigs snapped underfoot. The whispers followed, laughing, calling their names. Lisa, Jason, Mark ... Lisa tripped, crashing to the ground. Her hands scraped against the rough bark of a fallen tree, her flashlight tumbling from her grip. Somewhere nearby, Jason shouted, "Keep moving!" Lisa scrambled up, grabbing her flashlight and swinging it around wildly. A figure appeared in the beam, Emma. But this time, Emma wasn't alone. Dark shapes loomed behind her, their outlines shifting, writhing, their whispering voices seeping into Lisa's mind like poison. Lisa tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat. Emma smiled, her lips stretching too wide, her teeth too sharp. And then the whispers consumed everything. The world around Lisa collapsed into chaos. The whispers pressed against her skull, creeping through the cracks of her sanity like tendrils of darkness. Emma, if it was still Emma, stood before her, smiling that unnatural, too wide smile, her blackened pupils reflecting the dim light of Lisa's fallen flashlight. Lisa's breath came in short, ragged gasps. The others were out there, scattered in the woods, but the whispers made it impossible to tell which voices were real and which belonged to whatever had taken hold of Emma. The trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Shadows twisted and danced at the edges of her vision. Then Emma moved. Lisa barely had time to react before the thing wearing her friend's face lunged. Instinct took over. She grabbed the nearest rock and swung, feeling the sickening crunch as it connected with Emma's temple. Emma staggered back, but she didn't fall. She merely tilted her head at an unnatural angle, that eerie grin never faltering. "Lisa." The voice that crawled from Emma's throat was layered, as though more than one thing was speaking at once. "You should not have come." Lisa stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. The forest seemed to pulse around her, the whispering voices growing louder. Then, without another word, Emma turned and vanished into the trees. Lisa didn't wait. She snatched up her flashlight and ran, branches slapping against her arms and legs as she crashed through the undergrowth. She had to find the others. She had to get out of this nightmare. Jason clutched his hunting knife, his hands slick with sweat. He had lost sight of Lisa, Mark, and Ben in the chaos, and now he found himself alone in the suffocating darkness. His flashlight flickered erratically, the beam barely cutting through the thick fog that seemed to have risen from the ground itself. "Mark, Lisa," he called out, his voice hoarse. "Ben?" Only the whispers responded. Jason turned in a slow circle, his pulse pounding in his ears. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, identical and unyielding. He could no longer tell which way led back to the cabin. Then something moved in the corner of his eye. A figure stood just beyond the reach of his flashlight, shrouded in shadows. Jason tightened his grip on the knife. "Who's there?" The figure took a step forward, and Jason's breath caught in his throat. It was Rachel. But something was wrong. Her eyes were wide, unblinking. Her arms hung limply at her sides. Her clothes were torn, her skin streaked with dirt. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. And then, with slow, jerky movements, she raised her arm and pointed behind Jason. He turned just in time to see another figure emerging from the fog. It was Emma. "Jesus Christ," Jason whispered, taking a step back. Emma's head lolled to the side, her mouth still curved into that haunting smile. "Jason," she cooed, her voice syrupy sweet. "You should run." Jason didn't hesitate. He bolted, the flashlight bouncing wildly in his grasp. The whispers swirled around him, laughing, taunting. The forest blurred past in a dizzying rush of darkness and dread. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew he had to keep moving. Then he slammed into something solid. Mark. "Jesus, man," Mark yelped, grabbing Jason by the shoulders. "Where the hell did you go?" Jason wheezed, trying to catch his breath. "Emma. Rachel. Something's wrong, man." Mark's expression darkened. "I know. We have to get back to the cabin." Jason nodded, swallowing the rising panic. "Where's Ben?" Mark hesitated. I don't know. He was right behind me, but then the whispers started getting louder and..." He shook his head. "We'll find him. Let's go." Ben was running blind. The whispers had grown deafening, a cacophony of voices layering over one another, filling his head with nonsense and half-spoken sentences. His flashlight had died, leaving him at the mercy of the abyss. He stumbled forward, his foot catching on an exposed root. He hit the ground hard, pain flaring in his knee. Groaning, he pushed himself up, blinking against the darkness. A figure stood a few feet away. Ben's heart stuttered. "Hello?" No response. He squinted, his breath coming in shallow gasps. As his eyes adjusted, he realized something horrifying. The figure wasn't standing on the ground. It was hanging. Ben scrambled backward, his pulse roaring in his ears. The body dangled from a thick branch, its head lolling forward, its limbs unnaturally still. The rope creaked as it swayed slightly in the wind. And then, with a sharp jerk, the head snapped up. The face was Emma's. Ben screamed, stumbling to his feet and running as fast as his legs would carry him. The laughter of the whispers chased him, their voices crawling under his skin. Somehow, miraculously, he burst from the trees and found himself back at the cabin. The others were already there, huddled together, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. "Ben!" Lisa cried, running toward him. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. It's Emma. She's everywhere." Lisa knelt beside him, her hands gripping his shoulders. "We need to leave. Right now." "No," Jason said, his voice shaking. "We're not going anywhere until we know what's happening." "What's happening?" Rachel snapped. "We're being hunted, Jason. We need to run." Jason shook his head. "If we run without a plan, we'll die. We need to figure this out." The wind howled through the broken window, carrying the whispers with it. They were closer now, almost inside the cabin. The shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, curling and shifting like living things. Mark swallowed hard. "Then we better figure it out fast." A sharp, rhythmic knocking echoed through the cabin. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came from the door. Everyone froze. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate. Then a voice, soft, pleading. "Guys, it's me, it's Emma. Let me in." Lisa's hands clenched into fists. "No!" The knocking grew louder, more urgent. "Please, it's cold out here, I'm scared." Jason stepped forward, hesitating. "What if it's really her?" Mark grabbed his arm. "Don't." The whispers seeped into the room, curling around them like invisible tendrils. The knocking turned into pounding. The voice outside distorted, deepening, stretching. "Let me in." The door rattled on its hinges. Ben backed away, his entire body trembling. "If we don't get out of here now, we're never leaving." The pounding stopped. For a long, terrible moment, there was silence. Then the door burst open. A gust of darkness surged into the cabin, swallowing the light. The whispers erupted in laughter, high and sharp. The shadows came alive, reaching, pulling. Lisa screamed, and then everything went black. Lisa's scream was swallowed by the darkness. For a moment she felt weightless, as though she had been ripped from time itself. The shadows wrapped around her, pulling her into an abyss of whispers and shifting shapes. She kicked and flailed, desperate to grasp something, anything. But the void offered nothing but silence. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness spat her out. Lisa landed hard on the forest floor, the wind knocked from her lungs. She gasped, coughing as damp earth filled her nostrils. Her fingers clawed at the ground, reassuring her that she was back in reality, or at least some twisted version of it. A faint light flickered ahead. The cabin. But it wasn't the same. The once crumbling structure now stood pristine, its wooden walls freshly built, the glass in its windows unbroken. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the faint glow of lantern light seeped through the cracks of the door. Lisa's heart pounded. The whispers still lingered at the edge of her hearing, growing fainter yet more insidious. She pushed herself up, wobbling on unsteady legs. Where were the others? "Jason," she called out, her voice hoarse. "Mark? Ben?" No response. She turned in circles, scanning the trees. The dense fog had returned, thick tendrils curling around the trunks like ghostly fingers. Something moved within it, a shadow shifting between the trees. Watching. Lisa swallowed hard and forced herself toward the cabin. Jason awoke to the sound of footsteps. He was lying on a rough wooden floor, his head pounding, his limbs stiff with cold. A dull orange glow flickered nearby, casting dancing shadows against the walls. Slowly he lifted his head. Only it wasn't in ruins anymore. The air smelled of burning wood and something else, something acrid and metallic. Jason's fingers brushed against something wet, and he recoiled, his breath hitching as he saw the smear of crimson on the floorboards. His pulse thundered in his ears. He pushed himself up, ignoring the dull ache in his ribs. The cabin was eerily silent, save for the crackling of the fire in the hearth. His flashlight was gone. His knife was gone. He was defenseless. Then he heard it, a slow, rhythmic tap, tap, tap from the far corner of the room. Jason turned slowly. A figure sat at the old wooden table, bathed in shadows. A single candle flickered between them, casting an eerie glow on the rotting wood. The figure's fingers drummed against the surface in an almost casual manner. Jason's stomach twisted. It was Emma, but it wasn't. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, her pupils wide and empty. Her skin, once warm and full of life, now looked ashen, stretched too tightly over her cheekbones. Her lips curled into that same awful knowing smile. "Jason," she said, her voice layered, warped. "You came back." Jason took a step back, his breath shallow. "You're not Emma." Her smile widened. "Aren't I?" The candle between them flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows against the walls. Jason clenched his fists. He needed to get out, find the others. But the door behind him was gone. Only endless, suffocating darkness remained. "Where are my friends?" he demanded. Emma's head tilted further, the bones in her neck popping. "They're here." Jason's blood ran cold. A wet, choking gasp came from the darkness beyond the candlelight. Then another, and another. Figures emerged, their forms half-rotted, their eyes hollow sockets of despair. He recognized them. Rachel, Mark, Ben. Their bodies twitched unnaturally, their limbs bending at the wrong angles, their mouths moving without sound. Jason staggered back, horror clawing at his throat. "No, this isn't real." They heard the whispers, Emma said softly. And now, they belonged to them. Lisa reached the cabin door, her fingers trembling as she pressed against the wood. It was warm, as though the cabin itself was alive, pulsing with unnatural heat. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open. She stepped inside, and her stomach lurched. The cabin had changed. It was no longer the decayed, abandoned ruin they had first entered. Instead, it was alive with warmth, the scent of freshly baked bread and burning firewood filling the air. The table was set with plates of steaming food, as if waiting for guests. And sitting at the table, staring at her with empty eyes, were her friends. Jason, Mark, Rachel, Ben. They sat perfectly still, their expressions frozen in eerie serenity. Their eyes, however, were lifeless, their skin pale and waxy. Lisa's breath came in shallow gasps as she stepped closer. "Guys?" she whispered. No response. She reached out, hesitating before touching Jason's shoulder. His skin was ice cold. Lisa stumbled back, her pulse hammering. Something was very, very wrong. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. A shadow flickered in the corner of her vision. She turned sharply. Emma stood in the doorway leading to the back room, watching her with that same grotesque smile. Her eyes were pits of endless blackness, swallowing the light. She took a slow step forward. "Lisa," she whispered. "You shouldn't have come." Lisa's entire body screamed at her to run, but the whispers returned, louder than ever, crashing into her like a tidal wave. They wrapped around her thoughts, worming their way into the cracks of her mind, whispering, chanting, pulling. "Join us." Lisa clutched her head, squeezing her eyes shut. No, this isn't real." Emma took another step forward. "Oh, but it is." Lisa's breath hitched as the shadows behind Emma shifted, coiling into something grotesque. A mass of writhing limbs and hollow faces, mouths stretched open in silent screams. It surged forward, tendrils of darkness reaching for her. Lisa did the only thing she could. She ran. Jason struggled against the invisible force pulling him toward the abyss. He could feel the darkness wrapping around his limbs, dragging him into the void where his friends had already vanished. He wouldn't end like this. Summoning every ounce of strength, he fought against the whispers, against the cold tendrils clawing at his skin. He reached for the flickering candle, his last source of light. And then, through the suffocating blackness, he heard Lisa's voice. "Jason!" His eyes snapped open. Lisa stood at the threshold of the cabin, wild-eyed and breathless. Behind her, the shadows howled, surging forward like a living tide. Jason's body screamed in protest, but he forced himself to move, lunging toward her outstretched hand. Their fingers brushed. For a moment, the darkness roared in protest, and then the world shattered. Lisa and Jason tumbled onto the damp forest floor, gasping for breath. The whispers faded, retreating into the depths of the woods. The cabin behind them was once again a decayed ruin, its walls rotting, its windows shattered. Smoke no longer curled from the chimney. The scent of burning wood was gone. Jason turned onto his side, his body trembling. "Are we?" Lisa shook her head. "I don't know." They looked around, the forest eerily silent. No sign of Mark, no sign of Rachel, no sign of Ben. Only the wind remained, carrying with it the faintest whisper. "Run!" Lisa grabbed Jason's hand, pulling him to his feet. They didn't need to be told twice. They ran, and behind them, in the depths of the woods, the whispers laughed. Lisa's lungs burned as she sprinted through the endless trees, her heart hammering like a war drum. The whispers clawed at her mind, slithering into her thoughts, beckoning her to turn back, to surrender. But she didn't. She couldn't. Jason was right behind her, his breath ragged, his face pale with terror. The forest twisted around them, shifting and warping as though it were alive. The ground seemed to ripple beneath their feet, the trees bending unnaturally, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. "We have to," Jason panted. "We have to get..." A shriek cut through the night, high-pitched and otherworldly. Lisa didn't dare look back. Up ahead, the path split in two, left or right. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second before veering right. Jason followed without question. Then the forest shifted. The trees rearranged themselves, closing in like a living cage. The path they had taken mere seconds ago was gone, replaced by dense foliage and gnarled roots. "We're trapped," Jason gasped. Lisa spun in a circle, her chest rising and falling in panicked breaths. No, there has to be a way out. The whispers grew louder, closer. Then something stepped into view. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form flickering like a candle flame. At first, Lisa thought it was Emma. But it wasn't. It was something else wearing Emma's face. The imitation of her friend took slow, deliberate steps forward, its head tilting in unnatural angles. "Lisa," it whispered, its voice layered with echoes, as if multiple voices spoke through one mouth. "Why are you running?" Jason grabbed Lisa's wrist. "Go," he hissed. But Lisa was frozen. The thing that looked like Emma grinned wider, its lips stretching too far, exposing jagged, blackened teeth. "We can't let you leave," it cooed. Lisa's breath hitched. Then Jason yanked her arm, and they were running again. Lisa's legs ached as she ran, her muscles screaming for relief, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The thing wearing Emma's face was still behind them, its whispering voice slithering into her thoughts, trying to wrap itself around her mind like a noose. Jason gripped her wrist tightly, practically dragging her forward. "We need to find a way out of this forest," he panted. "There has to be something, somewhere." But the forest wasn't letting them leave. The trees bent unnaturally, their branches reaching downward like skeletal hands, blocking paths that should have led them out. The ground was shifting, turning into a looping nightmare where every direction looked the same. Lisa risked a glance back. The thing chasing them wasn't running. It didn't need to. It moved with an unnatural grace, its feet barely touching the ground. Its expression was calm, patient, because it knew. It knew they weren't escaping. A choked sob caught in Lisa's throat. "We're going in circles," she gasped. Jason stopped suddenly, his grip tightening. "Look." Ahead, beyond the twisted branches and shifting trees, was a break in the forest. A road. A real paved road cutting through the darkness. Relief flooded Lisa so hard she nearly collapsed. "We made it," she whispered. But then Jason's face paled. "Wait." Lisa followed his gaze. The road was there, but standing at its edge, barely visible in the fog, was Mark. Number not Mark. His body stood rigid, his arms hanging limply at his sides. His face was blank, expressionless, and his eyes were empty, pits of nothingness. And he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Rachel and Ben, their bodies just as lifeless, their heads slightly tilted like dolls waiting to be played with. They stood in perfect stillness, as if waiting. Lisa took a step back, her blood turning ice cold. "They're dead," she whispered. Jason shook his head violently. No, we saw them disappear, A new voice whispered from behind them. "You were never meant to leave." Lisa turned slowly. The thing wearing Emma's face was standing only a few feet away now. Up close, she could see how wrong it was. Its skin too smooth, its lips moving slightly even when it wasn't speaking, as though it were constantly whispering things too quiet for them to hear. It took a step closer. "It's time." Jason pushed Lisa behind him. "Stay back," he growled. The thing only smiled. "You don't understand, Jason." Its head tilted, neck cracking. "You never left the cabin." Lisa's heart stopped. "What?" The shadows behind the thing shifted, unraveling like smoke, revealing something hidden beneath the illusion. The forest melted away, the road vanished, and suddenly they weren't outside anymore. They were in the cabin. The same rotting, crumbling cabin they had started in. The walls sagged inward, covered in dark stains that pulsed like living wounds. The broken window let in no light, only darkness. Lisa turned wildly, looking for an escape, but there was none. Jason stood stiff beside her, his breathing shallow. "We never left," he whispered. The thing smiled wider, stepping closer. "You tried to leave." It reached out a hand, its fingers twitching like something unused to human movement. "But this place is part of you now, and soon, you'll be part of it." The whispers intensified, surrounding them, pressing against their skulls. Lisa clenched her fists. "No." The thing blinked. Lisa's voice rose. "No. I won't be part of this. I won't let you take us." Jason snapped out of his daze, his eyes flashing with determination. He grabbed Lisa's hand. "Then we fight." The thing in Emma's skin let out a low chuckle. You can't fight the inevitable. But Lisa and Jason weren't listening. They ran. Even though the walls were closing in, even though the shadows tried to pull them back, they ran. The cabin shuddered around them, the whispers growing enraged. The door wasn't there, but they ran toward where it should be, forcing their way through the darkness, through the suffocating pull of the thing's power. The whispers screamed. Then, light. Blinding, searing light. Lisa fell forward onto cold earth, gasping for air. The scent of pine and damp soil filled her nose. The whispers were gone, the shadows were gone, and the cabin was gone. She lifted her head. Jason was beside her, coughing. They were back in the real forest. The real one. The sun was rising, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange. Jason turned to her, eyes wide with disbelief. "Did we?" Lisa didn't answer. She didn't know how. They stood shakily, looking around. The road was real now. The real paved road leading back to civilization. No sign of the others. No sign of the whispers. They had escaped. But then, the wind whispered through the trees. Lisa froze. It was just the wind, wasn't it? She looked at Jason. He didn't say anything, but the fear in his eyes told her he had heard it too. The whisper, a single word, soft as breath. "Run." Lisa swallowed hard. She took Jason's hand, and they walked away, never looking back. But deep in the forest, where the cabin had once stood, the shadows remained, and they were waiting, waiting for the next ones to listen, waiting for the next ones to whisper back. The snow had been falling for hours, thick and relentless, coating everything in a heavy blanket of white. Daniel Carter stared out of the small, frost-covered window of his car, watching the snow swirl in the wind. He had been on the road for longer than he cared to admit, but it was too late to turn back now. The storm had hit harder than expected, and there was no way he was going to make it to his next destination. The isolated inn was his only option. His phone had no signal, and the map had lost its connection to reality once the roads had turned into nothing but a blur of white. In the distance, the faint outline of the inn appeared through the storm, a dark silhouette against the white chaos. He sighed, pulling the car up the narrow, winding path that led to the entrance. The inn stood like a forgotten relic from another era, its stone walls partially covered in snow, windows glowing with a faint yellow light. It wasn't much, small, perhaps even quaint in its own way, but it was exactly what he needed, a place to rest for the night, away from the endless highway and the isolation of the wilderness. As he pulled into the parking lot, he saw only one other car parked by the entrance. A few figures were huddled near the door, looking small and distant in the thick snow. Daniel grabbed his bag and stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting him like a slap in the face. The storm was worse than he had thought. His breath turned into vapor, and he pulled his coat tighter around him as he made his way toward the door. Inside, the warmth of the inn enveloped him, a welcome contrast to the biting cold outside. The air smelled faintly of pine and wood, a comforting scent that seemed to have been trapped within these walls for years. The lobby was dimly lit, with old-fashioned furniture and a crackling fire in the hearth. At the front desk, a woman looked up from her book, her eyes sharp but welcoming. "Welcome to the Frostview Inn," she said, her voice soft but firm. "How can I help you?" Daniel smiled. "I was hoping to get a room for the night. The storm's too bad to drive through." The woman's eyes lingered on him for a moment before she nodded. "Of course. We have a few rooms available. My name is Eleanor. I'll get you checked in." She took his details and handed him a key, a small brass tag attached to it. "Room 3, she said. "Dinner's served at 7 p.m. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Daniel nodded and made his way to the stairs, where a young man, probably in his late 20s, stood by the railing, watching him with an unreadable expression. "Are you here for business or pleasure?" the man asked, his voice calm and low. Daniel paused for a moment. "A little of both. I'm a journalist, here to write a piece about the old murders that happened here." It's a bit of a long shot, but I'm hoping to get some details. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. I wouldn't trust the locals too much. They don't like to talk about the past. Not since... He trailed off, his gaze flicking toward the back of the lobby, where Eleanor stood, watching them. "Thanks for the advice," Daniel replied, trying to gauge the man's tone. There was something about the way he said it that suggested there was more to the story. "What's your name?" "Mark," the man replied curtly, before turning away and disappearing into the hallway. Daniel shook his head, puzzled by the brief exchange. He had dealt with his fair share of suspicious locals during his years as an investigative journalist, and this inn was starting to feel like it was hiding something. But that was the job, right? To dig deeper, to uncover the truth, no matter how buried it was. He climbed the stairs, his boots creaking on the old wood beneath him. The inn had the feel of a place frozen in time, like a snapshot of the past, untouched and unchanging. The walls were adorned with old photographs, black and white images of people he didn't recognize. As he reached the door to his room, he noticed a faint scratch on the wood. A strange detail, but nothing that would draw attention at first glance. Inside, the room was simple but comfortable. The bed was large, covered in a thick quilt, and the small window gave him a view of the storm outside, the snow swirling in a frantic dance. The fireplace, though unlit, gave the room a cozy feel, and there was a small desk by the window where he could sit and get to work. He dropped his bag on the bed and opened his laptop, pulling up the notes he had gathered about the old murders. A local family had died in this very inn over 20 years ago, an unsolved mystery that had haunted the area ever since. The inn's owner, Eleanor, had been involved in some way, but the details were vague at best. The locals didn't like to talk about it, which only made Daniel more curious. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at it and saw a message from his editor. "Stay on this. If you find anything significant, we'll run it. But be careful. This could be dangerous." Dangerous. The word lingered in his mind. He had been on dangerous assignments before, but something about this place felt different. It wasn't just the storm or the isolation. It was the air of secrecy that seemed to hang over the inn. The strange tension between the guests and the staff, Eleanor's watchful eyes, and the way Mark had looked at him, as if he knew something more than he was letting on. Daniel's curiosity flared. He wasn't one to back down from a story, especially not one this promising. But as he sat there staring at his screen, a nagging feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't just a routine investigation. Something else was at play here, and whatever it was going to change everything. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a living creature, as Daniel sat at his desk, scanning the notes on the murders. Every few minutes, he would glance up from his screen, noticing the shifting shadows cast by the flickering firelight in the room. He rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of fatigue press against him. He had been traveling for days, and the isolation of the inn was starting to creep into his thoughts. He needed sleep, but something told him that tonight wasn't the night to rest. He looked out the window again. The snowstorm had intensified, reducing visibility to near nothing. The night was closing in, and he still hadn't had a chance to meet the other guests. The inn was eerily quiet, and a part of him felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. He shook off the feeling and stood, stretching his legs. A walk downstairs might clear his mind. As Daniel descended the staircase, the faint hum of conversation reached his ears. He entered the lobby and saw a small group gathered near the fire. Mark stood by the front desk, his back turned, speaking quietly to a woman whose face Daniel didn't recognize. She was tall, with striking features and long, dark hair that cascaded down her back in waves. Her eyes, however, were what caught Daniel's attention. Sharp, calculating, and oddly intense. Her gaze shifted to Daniel as he entered, and for a moment their eyes locked. She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Ah, another guest," she said coolly. "I'm Sophie. And you are?" "Daniel," he replied, offering a nod. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about her, something hidden beneath the surface. "This is my first time here," Daniel said, trying to sound casual. "How long have you been staying?" Sophie tilted her head slightly, considering the question. "I came here for a quiet break. The storm forced me to stay longer than I planned. Not a problem, though. I enjoy the solitude." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Solitude? You're not bored being stuck here?" Sophie laughed softly, her voice carrying an air of something darker than amusement. "Bored? Not at all. In fact, I think it's quite perfect. There's something about a place like this, hidden in the snow, where no one can get to you, that makes it feel timeless." Her words hung in the air longer than they should have. Daniel felt a strange chill pass through him, but he brushed it off. Sophie was just another guest, another person caught in the storm. Eleanor, the innkeeper, walked over at that moment, her smile tight but polite. "Dinner is ready," she said. "Please, join us. It's a small group tonight, but we can still enjoy some warmth and company." Daniel nodded, excusing himself from Sophie's gaze. As they made their way to the dining room, he took note of the small details. How Mark's eyes never left Sophie. The way Eleanor's smile never quite reached her eyes, and the feeling of being watched from every corner of the room. The dining room was warm, the table set for 5. Daniel took a seat at the end, feeling a sense of unease wash over him. It was hard to pinpoint exactly why, but the air felt thick, charged with an unspoken tension. Sophie and Richard, the man from earlier, were already seated at the table, along with his wife, Claire. They were eating quietly, glancing up at Daniel as he took his place. Richard Hale, the businessman, gave Daniel a cursory nod before returning to his meal. His wife, Claire, sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes downcast. She hadn't said a word since Daniel entered the room, and he couldn't help but notice the way her fingers trembled ever so slightly. "This storm is something else, isn't it?" Daniel said, trying to break the silence. "I've never seen snow like this before." Claire looked up at him, her pale blue eyes wide. She spoke in a soft, almost fragile voice. "It's been worse. The last time people got trapped for days. Some didn't make it out." The conversation stilled for a moment, the air growing heavier. Richard shifted in his seat, his face tightening, but he said nothing. Sophie's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile, and Eleanor, who had been standing by the kitchen door, looked back at the guests, her eyes narrowing. "What happened to them?" Daniel asked, his curiosity piqued despite himself. "Oh, it's nothing," Claire replied hastily. "Just some local stories. People get a little worked up in storms like this." Richard cleared his throat, cutting in. "We don't usually talk about such things here." The tension was palpable now, and Daniel could feel it creeping under his skin. There was something they weren't telling him, something unsaid that lingered like a shadow in the room. But he wasn't about to back off. As a journalist, digging deeper was his job. And this place, these people, felt like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Dinner continued in uneasy silence. The food was simple: roast chicken, vegetables, and a warm bread roll, but it seemed to lack the comfort it should have offered. After the meal, everyone retreated to their rooms, the only sounds the muffled whispers of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the building settling into the night. Daniel lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The murders, the inn's dark past, the strange behavior of the guests, the eerie feeling of being watched. He couldn't shake the sense that something was horribly wrong. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the people themselves. But Daniel knew deep down that he was not the only one hiding something in this place. The next morning, Daniel woke up to the sound of the storm still howling outside. The snow had piled up several feet deep, and it seemed as though the world outside had vanished into a sea of white. He rubbed his eyes, still groggy from the restless night, but something felt off. The usual morning sounds, clattering plates, soft chatter, were missing. The inn felt eerily quiet. He dressed quickly and headed downstairs, expecting to find the other guests in the dining room, ready for breakfast. But when he reached the lobby, the place was empty. A faint smell of coffee lingered in the air, but there was no one in sight. Daniel's heart rate quickened, a sense of foreboding creeping into his chest. The unease that had been gnawing at him since the night before was now an undeniable presence. Eleanor was behind the front desk, her face as calm and unreadable as ever. But her eyes were wide with concern. When she saw him, she straightened up, brushing her hands against her apron as though trying to wipe away a stain. "Mr. Carter," she said in a strained voice, "you might want to sit down. There's been an incident." Daniel felt a chill shoot through him. "What happened?" "Richard Hale," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's dead." The silence of the inn was deafening. When Daniel first stepped out of his room that morning, he was expecting the usual sounds of a busy breakfast routine, the clink of silverware, the murmur of conversation between guests, the comforting heat from the kitchen. These were the things that should have greeted him. But instead, there was nothing. The quiet was suffocating, and it sent an uncomfortable ripple through him. He descended the stairs cautiously, a vague sense of dread weighing heavily on his chest. The storm raged outside, an unrelenting force that seemed to mirror the growing tension in the house. The thick layers of snow piled up against the windows, blurring everything beyond. The inn, normally a place of refuge, now felt like a prison. Eleanor was behind the front desk, her hands clutching a cup of tea. She looked up as Daniel entered, her face pale, a slight tremor in her hands. Her usual composure had shattered, leaving her looking fragile and uncertain. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice soft but edged with an unmistakable anxiety. "You might want to sit down. There's been an incident." Daniel's mind raced, 1,000 thoughts flooding his consciousness at once. His eyes flicked to the doorway leading to the dining room. No one was there. No one but Eleanor, who was struggling to maintain her calm exterior. A cold feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. "What happened?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the growing unease. Eleanor took a slow breath, her gaze faltering as she spoke. "Richard Hale. He's dead." Daniel froze for a moment, his mind struggling to process the words. Richard Hale, the man he had only met the night before. The businessman with the cold, calculating eyes. He had seemed so distant, so unapproachable, but dead? How? "What do you mean, dead?" Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. He had seen enough murder scenes in his career to recognize that something foul was afoot. "How?" Eleanor hesitated. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully. It doesn't make sense. He was found in his room, his throat cut, but it didn't look like a struggle. The room was untouched, the door locked from the inside. Daniel felt his blood run cold. A locked room mystery. The kind of thing that made his heart race with both dread and fascination. The perfect setting for a psychological nightmare. "Where is everyone?" he asked, though he already had an inkling. The other guests, the ones he had met last night, had to know something. They had to be hiding something. "They're all in their rooms," Eleanor replied, her voice cracking slightly. I haven't told anyone yet. But you should go upstairs. The police won't be here for hours, and we need to figure out what happened before anyone else is hurt." Daniel nodded. His investigative instincts kicked in immediately. This was his chance to get to the heart of the mystery before anyone could cover it up. But the question nagged at him. What had happened to Richard? And why wasn't Eleanor more upset? She seemed too calm for someone who had just found a body in her inn. He made his way upstairs, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The sound of the storm outside intensified, almost as if it were warning him. The hallway was empty and a chill hung in the air, the kind of chill that made you shiver even when you were standing near a fireplace. He reached Richard's room, hesitating for only a moment before pushing the door open. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow of the morning light filtering through the snow-covered window. Richard's body was sprawled across the floor, his face frozen in an expression of shock. Blood pooled around his neck, dark and still. But there was something unsettling about the scene. It didn't feel right. The room looked too clean, too organized. There was no sign of a struggle, no signs of desperation. The door had been locked from the inside, and yet, Richard's death seemed to have been orchestrated with meticulous care. Daniel stepped inside cautiously, his eyes scanning every inch of the room for a clue. The bed was made, and the desk had a few papers neatly arranged, nothing out of the ordinary. He examined the bloodstains, the unnatural way they seemed to spread, but there was nothing more that stood out immediately. The killer had been clever, clean in their execution, but then his gaze fell on something that made his stomach turn. On the nightstand, just beside Richard's body, was a small piece of paper, a note, carefully folded, as though it had been placed there with purpose. Daniel moved closer, his hand trembling as he reached for it. He unfolded it slowly, as if expecting something horrific to jump out at him. The note was simple, 2 words, hastily written in a hand that was not Richard's. Trust no one. Daniel felt a cold sweat break out across his brow. He stared at the note for several moments, his mind racing. Who had left this? Was it a warning? Or was it part of the killer's twisted game? He pocketed the note, his mind working in overdrive. He had to figure out who in the inn was capable of such a thing, and why. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye in the corner of the room. A small suitcase, open but partially packed. Inside, Daniel noticed a few items that seemed out of place. Papers, photographs, and a few personal belongings, none of which had anything to do with Richard. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Could this be a clue? Or had the killer been planting evidence to throw him off the trail? He couldn't be sure, but one thing was clear. Richard's murder was only the beginning, and everyone in the inn was hiding something. It was only a matter of time before the truth would come to light. But would anyone survive long enough to see it? By the time Daniel returned to the lobby, he could feel the air growing thicker, heavier. His thoughts swirled in 1,000 directions, each one leading to dead ends or more questions. The cold, unsettling reality of the murder began to settle into his bones. And yet, there was something even more disturbing than the crime itself. The way the other guests were acting. Eleanor stood by the front desk, her hands shaking slightly as she stared at the door, her eyes unfocused. Mark had disappeared somewhere, but Daniel could sense that the man's earlier aloofness was turning into something darker. Even Sophie's calm demeanor had shifted, her sharp eyes now filled with a kind of predatory calculation. Claire was the first to speak when Daniel entered the room. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice fragile, but there was something in her eyes that made Daniel pause. Fear? Or something deeper? "Richard, he's dead?" Daniel nodded slowly, watching as her face drained of color. "Yes, throat slit. No sign of a struggle. The door was locked from the inside." She pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. I didn't know him well, but... Oh God, what's going to happen now?" Daniel noticed the way her fingers trembled as she spoke. She was either genuinely scared, or she was hiding something. Or both. But he couldn't rule her out as a suspect. Not yet. "I think we need to stay calm," Daniel said, his voice firm. "We need to figure out what's going on. Trust no one, not even me." He threw the words back at her, the same words from the note he'd found in Richard's room. "We all have to stick together." But even as he said it, Daniel could feel the truth of those words slipping away from him. How could they trust each other when everyone had something to hide? The fire in the lobby crackled and hissed, but no one was paying attention to its warmth. The room felt cold, not from the storm outside, but from the icy tension that had settled over the guests. Daniel could feel it, the shift, the palpable fear that clung to the walls like the thickening storm. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and suffocating, as each person in the inn grappled with the same question. Who would be next? Claire stood near the fireplace, her hand shaking as she clutched the hem of her sweater. Sophie, who had been observing quietly, finally spoke. "So," Sophie began, her voice low and measured. "Richard is dead, and we're all stuck here in this house, with a murderer among us. How reassuring." She looked directly at Daniel, her gaze piercing, as if trying to read him in ways that made him uncomfortable. "None of us are going anywhere until the storm lets up," Daniel said, his tone sharper than he intended. He could feel the weight of Sophie's eyes on him, but he refused to break under the pressure. "That means we're all going to have to deal with this together. We need to stay calm." "Stay calm?" Mark's voice came from the corner of the room. He had been silent until now, but his presence had been there all along. Lurking, watching. "How can we stay calm? We don't even know who we're dealing with." Mark's face was flushed with anger. His fists clenched tightly. "You're telling me to trust these people?" He gestured to the group, his eyes darting from one face to the next. "We're all strangers here, and now someone's dead. You think this is just coincidence?" Daniel met Mark's gaze, unwavering. "It's not about coincidence. It's about figuring out who's capable of murder, and why." "Exactly," Sophie said, her lips curling into a smile that sent a chill down Daniel's spine. "And in case you haven't noticed, we're all capable of something, aren't we?" Eleanor, who had been standing by the front desk, suddenly spoke up. "Enough." Her voice was more forceful than Daniel had ever heard it. She seemed to stand a little taller, as if trying to assert control over the situation. "We need to stay civil. The police won't be here for hours, and we can't afford to turn on each other like this. We need to stay together." The quiet hum of the storm outside seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed her words. The guests exchanged wary glances, each person considering the weight of Eleanor's statement. It was clear that everyone was on edge, and the slightest provocation could ignite a full-blown confrontation. The walls felt like they were closing in on them, each tick of the clock adding to the feeling of being trapped, not just by the storm, but by something far more sinister. Mark's eyes were burning with suspicion. "Who's to say we haven't been chosen? A sick game, a puzzle where we're the pieces. The storm keeps us isolated, and the killer watches. One by one, they'll pick us off, and there's nothing we can do about it." Daniel took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady despite the growing unease. "That's not helping. We need to figure out who Richard was. Who was he really? Maybe there's someone he knew. Maybe that's why he was killed. You think we're all in the dark here?" Sophie's voice was low, tinged with something dangerous. "You think Richard had a connection to all of us that makes this murder part of some larger story? We've all been brought here for a reason, Daniel. We're not as innocent as we seem." Daniel's pulse quickened. Her words were like a knife twisting in his gut. She was right about one thing: none of them were innocent. He had been investigating the deaths of others before coming here, but now, the tables had turned. He was no longer the outsider looking in. Now, he was part of this twisted puzzle. "I don't trust any of you," Mark muttered under his breath, his voice laced with venom. "Not anymore." The air in the room thickened, the walls closing in around them like an invisible cage. Each person's mind was racing with the same question. Who could they trust? They were all suspects now. Each one of them had secrets, motives, and desires that were hidden just beneath the surface. And in the face of murder, those secrets would come to light, whether they were ready or not. The following hours felt like days. The guests were left to stew in their paranoia, trapped in the inn as the storm raged outside. No one spoke unless they had to, and even then, the words came out like daggers. Daniel found himself pacing the lobby, his thoughts spiraling out of control. There were too many unanswered questions, too many pieces missing. Every instinct told him that Richard's murder was no random act. It was calculated. It was personal. He had to speak to the others. He had to find out what they knew, what they were hiding. It was Sophie who broke the silence first, though. She had been eerily quiet since their heated exchange earlier. Now, she leaned against the wall by the window, staring out at the snow. Her voice was calm, controlled, but there was an edge to it that made Daniel uneasy. "You know," she said, not turning to face him, "I think I understand why people kill. Not because of rage or greed, but because of fear. Fear of being found out. Fear of losing control." Daniel froze, his mind racing. "What do you mean?" She turned slowly, her gaze meeting his with an unsettling intensity. "We all have something to hide, some more than others. And when you're trapped, when you can't escape, it becomes a matter of survival. Some people will do anything to protect their secrets." Daniel swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. He was beginning to see the truth in them. They were all afraid of what the others knew, of what they could uncover. And fear, more than anything, could drive people to do unspeakable things. Just as he opened his mouth to respond, a sudden shout pierced the air, followed by a crash from upstairs. Without thinking, Daniel bolted up the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. What had happened now? Daniel reached the second floor and saw Eleanor standing in front of Richard's room, her face pale and stricken with shock. A small crowd had gathered behind her. Claire, Mark, and Sophie were all there, their expressions tense. I found something," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. She pushed the door open, and the group followed her inside. Richard's room was undisturbed, but there was something new. The bed had been pulled back, and beneath it, hidden in the shadows, was a black briefcase. It had been missed the first time Daniel had come into the room. Eleanor opened it, and inside, there were stacks of paper, photographs, and what looked like financial records. There was also a small notebook with Richard's handwriting, pages of cryptic notes and dates. One particular name was scrawled repeatedly on a page: Mark Hale. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. "Mark," Daniel said, turning slowly toward him. "What's going on? Why was your name in Richard's notebook?" Mark's face turned ashen, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for words. Sophie's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, and Claire's face paled as she looked between the two men. Mark's face turned a shade of pale that bordered on sickly, and he stepped back, hands raised in defense. "It's not what you think," he stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure. But there was something in his eyes, something desperate, that made Daniel doubt the sincerity of his words. Eleanor's trembling hands clasped the notebook tighter as she stared at the name scrawled across the page. "Mark Hale," she whispered, as though saying it aloud made it real. "Why is your name here?" Daniel asked, his voice firm, his instincts telling him that Mark was more involved in this than he was letting on. Mark started, but his words were lost in a sudden burst of angry, frantic energy. "This is ridiculous. You don't know anything. You think you know what's going on here, but you don't. Richard and we had business dealings, yes. But this?" He gestured wildly to the room, his eyes wild with panic. "This is insane. I don't know anything about Richard's death." But the damage was done. The name Mark Hale on Richard's personal notes was a connection they could not ignore. Daniel's mind raced. Was it a clue? Or was it an elaborate red herring planted by the killer to divert attention? Sophie, who had been eerily silent until now, stepped forward. Her gaze was cold, calculating. "Isn't it convenient that the one person whose name is written all over Richard's things is the one person who's losing control here?" Mark's eyes snapped to Sophie, fury flashing across his face. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Sophie wasn't finished. "Oh, I think I do," she replied, her voice sweet and mocking. "You're all just as trapped as we are, Mark. You had a secret with Richard, didn't you? Business, money, something you didn't want us to know about." Daniel glanced at Eleanor, who was still clutching the notebook. Her pale face mirrored the unease in the room, her wide eyes darting from person to person. The storm outside had subsided somewhat, but inside, the emotional storm was just beginning. Everyone was on edge. Everyone was afraid. Claire, who had been quiet for most of the exchange, suddenly spoke up. I don't believe this. I know all of you, at least a little, and none of this makes sense. Mark, you're acting guilty, sure, but there's something else going on here. We all have to figure out what Richard knew. There's more to this than a simple murder. Daniel nodded in agreement. We need to stick together. But at the same time, he trailed off, suddenly realizing how hollow his words sounded. The group was no longer united. The suspicion had fractured them into factions, and it was only a matter of time before one of them would snap. The room was silent as the weight of the situation bore down on them. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as if time itself had stopped. Suddenly, a loud crash broke the silence, a sharp, violent sound coming from downstairs. Everyone in the room froze. A gasp from Claire echoed in the space as the four of them exchanged looks of pure terror. "Stay here," Daniel ordered, his voice taut with urgency. He turned quickly and ran toward the stairs. The others followed closely behind, the sound of their footsteps almost drowned by the loud, unsettling silence that lingered in the inn. They reached the lobby and found the source of the crash. The front door, flung open, a gust of cold wind whipping through the space, but no sign of anyone who had caused it. Who opened the door?" Claire asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sophie was the first to approach. "It's impossible. The door was locked," she said, her eyes scanning the area as she looked for any signs of the intruder. The storm had picked up again, howling with an eerie ferocity that seemed to echo the rising tension inside the inn. The door had been unlocked and opened from the inside. Someone had left, or someone had let someone in. Daniel's mind raced. This wasn't just a murder. It was a game. A twisted game where they were all pawns. Hours passed, each one more unbearable than the last. The storm outside intensified, as though mocking the chaos inside. They were trapped, unable to leave, with their suspicions growing darker by the minute. The group had scattered, trying to avoid one another, each person searching for answers, yet no one daring to trust anyone else. But Daniel knew something had to give. He couldn't let the killer pick them off, one by one. He spent hours alone in Richard's room, searching for anything that might reveal more about the businessman's life and connections. The briefcase, the photographs, the cryptic notes. All of it pointed towards something larger than just a business deal gone wrong. And then finally, he found it. A single photograph, slipped between the pages of Richard's notebook. In it, Richard was standing next to an older man, his arm draped around his shoulders. The man's face was familiar, though Daniel couldn't place him at first. Then the realization hit him. The man in the photo was Richard's father. But what struck Daniel the most wasn't the connection to Richard. It was the connection to Eleanor. Eleanor Hale. The truth slammed into him like a freight train. Eleanor had lied. She wasn't just the innkeeper, she was Richard's sister. His suspicions about Eleanor had been simmering beneath the surface, but now they boiled over. She had known exactly what was going on. She knew who was responsible for Richard's death, and she had been hiding it. Daniel rushed back downstairs, a sense of urgency driving him. He found Eleanor by the front desk, staring out the window as if waiting for something. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and firm. "We need to talk." Eleanor turned slowly, her face pale, but her eyes were hard. "What do you want from me, Daniel?" she asked, her voice cold. "I know who you are," Daniel said quietly. "You're Richard's sister." Eleanor's lips trembled for just a moment, but she quickly regained control. "You don't know anything," she replied, her voice laced with venom. "I know enough to know that you've been hiding something," Daniel said, his voice gaining strength. "And I think you know exactly who killed Richard." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, and she took a step back. "You think you can just accuse me of murder? You have no idea what you're talking about." "You've been playing all of us," Daniel shot back, his voice rising. "You were involved in whatever Richard was tangled up in. And now that he's dead, you're trying to cover it up." There was a long pause, the silence between them heavy and thick. And then, Eleanor spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't understand. Richard, he wasn't who you thought he was. He was dangerous. And when he started threatening me, when he threatened to ruin everything I worked for, her voice cracked, and for a moment, it was as if the woman before him was not the same calm, collected innkeeper. "Did you kill him?" Daniel demanded, his heart racing. "I didn't kill him," Eleanor replied, shaking her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "But I know who did." Before Daniel could react, a voice called from the doorway. "Eleanor," Mark said, his voice cold and low. "You're not the only one with secrets." Eleanor looked up sharply, her face pale. Mark stepped into the room, his eyes locked on hers with a mixture of contempt and fear. "I didn't want it to go this far," Mark continued. "But when Richard started to push me, started to blackmail me, I had no choice. I couldn't let him ruin everything." Eleanor stepped back, her face crumbling as she realized Mark's involvement. "You," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "Yeah," Mark said with a bitter laugh. "It's me. I killed him." In the end, it wasn't just Richard's death that shattered the guests of the inn. It was the truth about their own involvement in the twisted web of betrayal, greed, and fear that had ensnared them all. Eleanor and Mark had been hiding their dark secrets, trying to cover up their roles in a scheme that had gone too far. As the storm finally began to subside, the police arrived to take them all into custody. They were all suspects now, and as the dawn broke over the snow-covered mountains, the truth had been revealed. But at what cost? The inn was silent once more, save for the soft wind whispering through the cracks in the windows. The guests had been broken, and the murderer was caught. But the damage had been done, and the truth, as always, had been far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined.